Welcome back, economic students. This is the second video in the series on the chapter on basic macroeconomic relationships. In the previous video, we examined the basic macroeconomics of relationships of disposable income, consumption, and savings, which led to a discussion on the average propensity to consume, average propensity to save, marginal propensity to consume, and marginal propensity to save. From there, we moved on to our study of the multiplier. So this is the last economic principle or concept tied to that chapter, and this particular video investigates what's called the investment demand curve. So what is investment, right? See up top here it says investment. It's an important 16% of GDP. Because remember, GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X. Consumer expenditures on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Gross business investment, which we're going to be discussing here in detail. Business spending, right? Of course, government spending and net exports. So gross business investment, the I component of GDP, refers to when giant corporations or small mom and pop shops or everything in between purchases machines, equipment, tools, factories, any type of factory expansion, plant expansion, upgrading logistics systems, software and technology expenditures. So it's the driving force of all economic activity. You can see this idea of it's the catalyst of all economic activity. So you got to think about the relationship between a business purchasing a large machine and the economic effects of such an investment, right? So if a business decides it's worth their profitable interest to spend $5 million upgrading or replacing a machine, they figure there's going to be significant demand for the usage of that machine, which means the company that builds the machine is going to receive more orders, which means employment tied to the usage and distribution of the goods and services associated with that machine will increase. So that's why it's a leading economic indicator. If you look at investment as a percentage of GDP, and we already said it's 16%, and you tie this to the business cycle, anytime gross business investment falters, the U.S. economy is going to suffer a recession. And the longer investment spending wanes, the longer the recession will last. So, good review here of what we mean by investment and identifying why investment is such an important component of GDP. On the previous slide, we revisited the economic principle of investment and discussed the macroeconomic importance of investment spending as a component of GDP. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X. Investment spending or gross business investment refers to the purchase of machines and equipment and tools and factories and refurbishing such items by businesses. Although it's only 16% of GDP, it's a driving force behind business cycles. On the next slide, we're going to build what's called the investment demand curve. The investment demand curve helps us identify the quantity of investment spending, and it's based on the relationship between the expected rate of return on a new business venture and the real rate of interest in the economy. On this slide, we're going to discuss the expected rate of return. Most students who take introductory micro and macroeconomics are business students. Most likely you have performed a similar exercise in your marketing or management or perhaps an introductory finance class, building the expected rate of return for a business project or proposal. So what goes into determining the expected rate of return for a business? Obviously, if a business is going to spend large amounts of money on some new project, idea, proposal, service, they want to have some guesstimation on what their expected rate of return will be on the project. The first item on the checklist is the structure of the industry. Any business worth its salt of gold will say, hey, let's figure out what's going on with this industry prior to getting involved. If you remember from microeconomics, the idea of pure competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly, a business is going to identify the barriers to entry involved with attempting to compete in this industry. They will investigate who are the big players and is it possible for a new entrant to profitably compete with existing firms. Speaking of profits, the next item on the list is profit margins. So, corporations publish quarterly reports and annual reports. Information is readily available to anyone and everyone. It's easy to determine profit margins or typical profit margins in a specific industry or sector of the economy. However, privately held companies don't have to report this information, but it's always a good idea for a business to determine, or at least attempt to determine, what potential profit margins for each item of sale will be in the new business venture. Now, low profit margins aren't necessarily deterrent to attempting to start a new business. For instance, supermarket chains typically have low profit margins on every item they sell, but they make it up in mass volumes. After investigating the structure of the industry and the potential profit margins, companies should investigate initial operating costs. If the firm is going to build a plant or construct a factory, what is it going to cost to acquire the land, the licensures? How much is it going to cost to actually erect the factory? What are the potential costs involved with acquiring and hiring labor? So initial operating costs are going to be a huge proponent of determining expected rate of return. Obviously, if a business is getting involved with some new venture, they're probably going to have to invest in some marketing and advertising. So how much marketing and advertising expense should we expect right off the get-go? Another idea is macroeconomic forecasting. So most companies, medium to large size companies, have economists on staff. These macroeconomic forecasters, to the best of their ability, attempt to determine where the U.S. is in its business cycle and what the state of the global economic picture or landscape appears to be at the moment, and forecast how that picture may change over the next 6 months to 6 years. From all of this data or information, businesses will build a best case, worst case, and most likely scenario to try to determine the expected rate of return. When you read this in the textbook, they don't go into this much detail, but it's important to understand when we build the investment demand curve that expected rate of return does get a large amount of concentrated effort prior to a business attempting to compete in some new industry or launch some new product. All right, let's build the investment demand curve by discussing this relationship between the expected rate of return, which we discussed in detail in the previous slide, and the real rate of interest in the economy. So the real rate of interest is easy to explain. We covered this idea when we investigated inflation. The nominal rate of interest is the stated rate on any type of loan or bond or savings agreement. The real rate of interest is any of those numbers minus the expected amount of inflation over the time period under consideration. An example will help to clarify. Let's assume that you bought a 10-year Treasury note and the yield on the 10-year Treasury note was 4%. So you're lending your money to the government for 10 years, and it says on the bond you purchased that you will receive a 4% annual rate of return for lending your money to the government for 10 years. 4% is not your actual rate of return. That's the nominal rate. The real rate of interest is the nominal or stated rate minus the expected rate of inflation over that time period. So if inflation averages 2% over that time period, the real rate of interest is the stated or nominal rate, 4%, minus the 2% on the agreement. So the real rate of interest is 2%. So R equals I. What does this mean, right? It's a relationship between the real rate of interest and the amount of planned business investment that we're going to expect after we graph the relationship between the expected rate of return and the real rate of interest on the investment demand curve. Now let's look at the investment demand curve graphically. On the left-hand side, we have this numeric relationship between the amount of planned business investment and the relationship between the expected rate of return and the real rate of interest. So on this particular graph on the right, down bottom, we have our typical quantity axis on the horizontal axis, the x-axis, similar to any demand curve. On the vertical axis, we don't have price. Notice we have R and I. In other words, we have graphed both the expected rate of return and the real rate of interest. The green downward sloping demand curve is derived from the data on the left-hand side. So it's a pretty straightforward principle. Let's start with an interest rate somewhere near the middle. So if we assume that today the interest rate in the economy is 8%, given an 8% real rate of interest, the question is how many potential projects, how much new planned business investment would take place, assuming that businesses would only undertake this investment if the expected rate of return was greater than or equal to the real rate of interest, right? So that's the key idea. A business will undertake some type of planned business investment if and only if the expected rate of return on the project, the investment, is greater than or equal to the real rate of interest. So for this economy, using this data as the example, if the real rate of interest is 8%, we would expect 20, and that's in billions of dollars, $20 billion worth of planned business investments. So notice that if the interest rate drops from 8% to 6%, the amount of planned business investment would increase from 20 to $25 billion. And that should make sense logically, right? What we're saying here is that there are more planned business investments where the expected rate of return would be greater than 6% than there would be at 8%, right? So the lower the domestic real rate of interest in the economy, the more planned business investment. Now you understand the important relationship between interest rates and investment spending. All right, ceteris paribus, other things equal, lower interest rates entice businesses to borrow and invest, right? So if you think about, okay, if our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve, lowers interest rates from 8% down to 4%. Now, how the Fed accomplishes such a goal, monetary policy is the focus of another chapter. For now, you can just take my word that the Federal Reserve controls the nation's money supply and can lower interest rates by increasing the money supply and increase interest rates by decreasing the money supply. So if our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve, current Fed Chair Jerome Powell, if our Federal Reserve decides to increase the money supply and lower the real rate of interest from 8% to 4%, planned business investment would increase from $20 billion to $30 billion. So there would be an increase in $10 billion in planned business investment with the now lower interest rate. Also remember that this is going to tie back to our study of the multiplier, right? If interest rates were to drop and planned business investment increases, This is only the beginning of the economic activity associated with the increase in investment spending, not the total change in GDP. But one more time, quick review. The relationship between the real rate of interest in the economy and the expected rate of return, right? Lower interest rates entice businesses to borrow and invest in machinery, equipment, tools, factories, plant expansion. Higher interest rates stifle that activity because it's more challenging to find potential investments, that is to say, potential new strategic business units or potential new business proposals where the expected rate of return is greater than the now higher rate of interest. Now, here's a really good question. Let's assume we revisit our example of Nike Corporation. Let's assume that Nike Corporation is deciding whether or not to get into something such as the apparel industry, right? So Nike's saying, oh, is it worth us getting into apparel? And they did all of their homework on the previous slide. Right? They looked at all the factors that we just discussed about calculating the expected rate of return. And let's assume that they calculate the expected rate of return over the next 10 years to be 6%. And then they look and say, well, the real rate of interest in the economy is 6.5%. So other things equal, they would say, well, that's not worth it, because why would we borrow at 6.5% to make back only 6%? So if the real rate of interest is greater than the expected rate of return, that potential investment would not take place. But a question arises, say, okay, what if it was going to take $100 million to start this new business proposal? And let's say that Nike Corporation didn't need to borrow the money. Let's assume that they had plenty of cash on their balance sheet, literally hundreds of millions of dollars on their balance sheet. So they don't have to borrow at 6.5% to get this new project up and running because they have the money on their balance sheet. The question then becomes, does the relationship between the real rate of interest and the expected rate of return still apply? In other words, should Nike undertake this proposal, assuming that they don't need to borrow the $100 million, if the real rate of interest is 6.5% and the expected rate of return is 6%? So let's think about this and relate it back to something we studied earlier, the idea of marginal benefits, marginal cost, opportunity cost, and rational behavior. Here's what most students and really individuals in the economy fail to recognize. The interest rate is the interest rate for borrowers and lenders. So if the real rate of interest is 6.5% and the expected rate of return on the potential business venture is only 6%, Nike would be better off being a lender in that market. Take the $100 million that they have on their balance sheet, lend the money at 6.5% and earn 6.5%, as opposed to attempting to open this new business unit and only earn 6%. That's why the relationship between the expected rate of return and the real rate of interest always holds true, regardless whether or not the companies who are making the decisions have the cash on their balance sheets. Continuing our discussion of how much planned business investment will take place in the economy, we will have to examine what we call the instability of investment, which means that although the relationship between the expected rate of return and the real rate of interest is the primary driving force behind planned business investment, there are a few other factors which impact a business decision whether or not to purchase new machinery, equipment, logistics systems, technology, or refurbish existing equipment. So the question comes down to, first, durability. In other words, if a business wants to stay in business, they need certain machines and equipment and factories. So if and when those machines need to be replaced, you really don't have a choice. So if at the end of their business life cycle, that's going to impact when the business decides whether or not to purchase equipment and make planned business investment. This idea of irregularity of innovation, a good example of this would be the period of time in the late 80s, early 90s, and then the late 90s. So for instance, in the late 80s and early 90s, it's when computerization and networking and the internet all of a sudden made significant improvements to systems and productive efficiency available in the economy. So businesses rushed to implement these new possibilities of profitability improvements into their existing infrastructure and systems. So there was a drive during that period to transform from the previous means or mechanism of getting from A to B to Z in producing and providing a good or service to the improvement. So for instance, Walmart readily identified the potential profitability of the barcode as not only a means to determine how much someone's bill was at checkout, but to increase the efficiency of supply chain management and to profit from consumer trends that were easily acquired by collecting data, right? Later in the 90s, improvements in those existing technologies were available, but businesses realized good is good enough. So even though there were faster systems, there was not as much incentive to invest in a faster system if the existing system was doing what it was required or an adequate job. Another good example that would be something like solar panels. One of the sort of problems with businesses adopting solar is the upfront cost. Businesses would hesitate to install solar panels on the roofs of their existing plants or property or factories in fear of two things. Number one is that it's a serious investment. If they're not going to be there for the life of the investment, it doesn't make it worth it. And are there going to be a better solar panel available 5 years down the road? The last idea is variability of profits and expectations. That is highly tied to or correlated with macroeconomic forecasting in the business cycle. So even though businesses might do the best possible job of estimating profitability, it's not always accurate, and therefore it influences how much planned business investment actually takes place. Here we see a global perspective. Now notice this is the year 2004 where we measured business investment, gross business investment as a percentage of GDP. Even though this goes back 16 years because it's now 2020, notice as a percentage of GDP, you scroll down to the United States. The United States as a percentage economic output, gross business investment is roughly the same, which is interesting. You say, okay, well, the structure of the economy hasn't altered that much in a decade and a half. All right. You also look and say, wow, South Korea, Japan, Mexico, significantly higher percentage of their overall spending is dedicated to planned business investments. This final slide on the video presentation graphs the correlation or relationship between gross domestic product and actual business investment. So on the horizontal axis, we simply have time from 1975 through 2004. And on the vertical axis, we have percentage change in both GDP and planned business investment or actual business investment that took place. So obviously the blue is GDP, the red is planned business investment. How much businesses spend on machines, equipment, factories, tools, property, plant, technological advancements. So notice that the volatility of gross business investment is much greater than the overall volatility of the whole economy. That again reinforces the idea that we introduced at the beginning of this video, that investment spending is a leading economic indicator. Last idea for this particular video, simply remember that planned business investment ties back into the multiplier. Anytime business investment increases, there's going to be a multiplied effect on the overall economy or a cumulative overall impact on the economy. And anytime businesses decrease their planned business investments, it's going to have a spiraling negative effect on the overall health and well-being of the U.S. economy.